Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Hello to all my listeners. My name is Jack, and I've been a long-haul trucker across this great American landscape for 23 years. In all my time on the open road, I've seen just about everything you can imagine. But there's one story that still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. It happened about 7 years ago during a late autumn haul through the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. I was taking a heavy load from Charlotte up to Washington, D.C., following Route 81 north before cutting east. Anyone who's driven through those mountains knows they're beautiful during the day. But at night, especially when the weather turns, they can become downright menacing. That particular night in mid-November was one of the worst I'd ever seen. A fierce storm had rolled in, bringing torrential rain that pounded against my windshield like it was trying to break through. The fog was so thick it seemed to swallow my high beams whole, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Those winding mountain roads are treacherous enough in good weather, but in conditions like that, every curve becomes a potential disaster. I had the wipers going full blast, but they barely made a difference against the wall of water coming down. The ancient oak trees that line parts of that route were swaying dangerously in the wind, their massive shadows dancing across the road like specters. The effect created this suffocating tunnel of darkness that only enhanced my growing sense of isolation. I was exhausted, had been on the road for 13 hours by that point, but my delivery deadline was tight, and I couldn't afford to stop. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting metal, combined with the steady hum of my engine, created this hypnotic backdrop that made staying alert a constant battle. As I drove, I remembered stories other truckers had shared about this particular stretch of highway. They called it Dead Man's Pass because of the unusually high number of fatal accidents that had occurred there over the decades. Some of the older drivers spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences, unexplained breakdowns, sudden temperature drops in their cabs, and bizarre radio interference. I'd always written these off as typical trucker folklore, the kind of stories we tell to keep ourselves awake during those long midnight hauls. It was approaching 2 in the morning when I reached the most notorious section of Dead Man's Pass, a series of tight switchbacks that descend steeply along the mountainside. My rig was heavy with industrial equipment, and I could feel the weight pushing against my brakes as I navigated each hairpin turn. Every fiber of my being was focused on maintaining control, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, my eyes straining to see through the rain-soaked darkness. That's when I saw her, on the sharpest curve of the descent, standing motionless on the shoulder of the road, was a woman in what appeared to be a pale blue dress. Despite the punishing rain, she wasn't seeking shelter. She just stood there, completely drenched, her long dark hair plastered against her face. As my headlights swept across her, I could swear she turned directly toward me, her eyes reflecting the light with an unnatural brightness. My heart nearly stopped. I instinctively jerked the wheel, causing my trailer to fishtail dangerously on the wet asphalt. For a terrifying moment, I thought I was going over the guardrail and down the mountain. Somehow I managed to regain control, my pulse thundering in my ears. I pulled over about 50 yards past where I'd seen her, the hazard lights blinking against the darkness. Something told me I needed to help her. No one should be out in weather like this, especially not on this treacherous stretch of highway. I grabbed my flashlight and rain jacket, then stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked me over, and the rain hit my face like tiny needles. I made my way back to where I'd spotted her, sweeping my flashlight across the roadside. There was nothing. No woman. No footprints in the muddy shoulder. Nothing but the howling wind and the endless sheets of rain. I stood there for several long moments, confusion and unease washing over me. Had I imagined her? Was I more tired than I thought? I walked a bit further in both directions, calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. Eventually, I returned to my truck, soaked to the bone and thoroughly unsettled. I climbed back into the cab, cranked up the heat, and tried to shake off the encounter. Maybe it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those bright, piercing eyes staring directly into mine. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, determined to put some distance between myself and that spot. But as I accelerated, something changed inside the cab. The air grew heavy and unnaturally cold, despite the heater running full blast. A strange pressure built in my ears, like I was descending rapidly in an airplane. I turned on the radio, hoping some music might help clear my head, but all I got was static and occasional fragments of what sounded like a woman's voice, too distorted to make out the words, but somehow familiar. Then I felt it, a sensation of not being alone. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, searching the darkness behind my seat. Nothing, but when I glanced at the passenger side, my blood turned to ice. She was there. The woman from the roadside sat beside me, water cascading from her blue dress onto my upholstery. Her skin was pale as moonlight, with a slight bluish tinge, and her eyes, those eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that paralyzed me with fear. For just a moment, I saw her clearly before she vanished, leaving only a damp spot on the seat. I nearly crashed then and there. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the wheel. Sweat poured down my face, despite the unnatural cold that had enveloped the cab. I was no longer tired. Adrenaline had seen to that. But now I was faced with a new challenge, maintaining my sanity. The whispering started soon after. At first, I thought it was just the wind finding its way through the seals around my windows. But gradually, it took shape, forming words. Jack, it seemed to say over and over, in a soft, almost melodic tone that somehow cut through the noise of the engine and the storm. Jack, help me. Jack, with each passing mile, the whispers grew more insistent and the temperature dropped further. My breath began to fog in front of me, and the windows started to frost over in the middle of November with the heater running. I kept checking my mirrors and glancing nervously at the passenger seat, expecting to see her materialize again. At one particularly sharp turn, I felt something touch my shoulder, something ice cold and damp. A violent shudder ran through my entire body, and I jerked my head around to find her sitting there again, this time more solid, more present. Her face was a mask of desperation and sorrow, water still streaming from her hair and clothes. her eyes now clearly revealing emptiness and pain. I shouted in terror and swerved hard, the back end of my trailer breaking loose on the wet pavement. For several heart-stopping seconds, I fought for control as 18 wheels and 80,000 pounds of steel skidded toward the guardrail. By some miracle, I managed to straighten out just before disaster. But I was now thoroughly convinced I wasn't alone, and that whatever was with me wasn't of this world. I pulled over immediately, my entire body trembling, sweat mingling with tears of fear. The rain continued its assault on my truck, but now it seemed like the least of my worries. I was trapped in my cab, with something I couldn't explain or escape. I considered calling someone, but what would I say? Who would believe me? I sat there for several minutes, trying to calm my racing heart, trying to convince myself that I was just overtired, that my mind was playing elaborate tricks on me. Eventually, I decided to continue. I couldn't sit there forever, and Washington, D.C. was still hours away. I put the truck in gear and eased back onto the road, every nerve ending in my body on high alert. The whispers continued, sometimes fading to barely audible murmurs, other times rising to urgent pleas right next to my ear. Jack, please help me. Don't leave me here. Jack, I drove like a man possessed, faster than was safe given the conditions, desperate to reach civilization, other people, anything to break this nightmarish isolation. The phantom presence ebbed and flowed, sometimes so strong I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, other times receding until I almost believed she was gone, only to return with renewed intensity. After what felt like an eternity of terror, I spotted the glowing sign of a truck stop ahead, a 24-hour place just off the highway near Roanoke. Never in my life had I been so happy to see such a mundane sight. I pulled in and parked, practically falling out of my truck in my haste to get away from that haunted cab. The truck stop was busy despite the hour, with drivers seeking refuge from the storm. The fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee and greasy food, the sound of normal human conversation. It all felt like heaven after what I'd just experienced. I found an empty booth in the corner of the diner and ordered the largest coffee they had. As I sat there, hands still shaking slightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Glancing around nervously, I noticed a group of drivers at a nearby table looking in my direction. One of them, an older man with a salt and pepper beard and weathered face that spoke of decades on the road, approached my table. "You all right there, partner? Looks like you've had quite a night," he said, his voice carrying a slight Appalachian drawl. I hesitated for a moment, then decided I had nothing to lose. I told him everything, the woman on the curve, her appearance in my truck, the whispers, the cold, all of it. When I finished, I expected ridicule or at least skepticism. Instead, the old driver nodded gravely. "You saw the lady in blue," he said simply. "She shows up on that stretch of Dead Man's Pass whenever the weather turns nasty. Been happening for at least 40 years that I know of." Another driver, younger, but with eyes that had seen their share of highway miles, joined us. Legend has it she was a newlywed whose car went off the road back in the 70s, he explained. Story goes that her husband was driving drunk, crashed through the guardrail. She survived the initial crash, but died from exposure wandering the roadside in the rain, looking for help that never came. "And now she flags down truckers?" I asked, still trying to process what I was hearing. The older driver shook his head. "Some say she's warning them about the dangerous curve where she died. Others think she's looking for a ride to wherever she was trying to get to. But there's something else." He paused, exchanging glances with the younger man. "What?" I pressed, feeling a new wave of unease. "They say that those who see her often have close calls on the road later. Like she's a portent of sorts. Or maybe she's trying to save others from her fate. Hard to say." A chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes ran down my spine. What am I supposed to do now? The older driver reached into his pocket and pulled out a small medallion sent. "Christopher, patron saint of travelers. Take this," he said, placing it in my palm. "Say a prayer when you get back on the road. Stay alert. And if you see her again, acknowledge her. Sometimes that's all they want to be seen, to be remembered." I stayed at that truck stop longer than I should have, talking with the drivers and gathering my courage for the remainder of my journey. Their stories of the lady in blue and other highway specters across America both frightened and fascinated me. In a strange way, knowing I wasn't alone in my experience brought some comfort. When I finally returned to my truck, I approached it cautiously, half expecting to see her waiting for me. The cab was empty, but the lingering sense of a presence remained. I placed the sent Christopher medallion on my dashboard, started the engine, and continued my journey, whispering a prayer as the older driver had suggested. The rest of the drive was tense but uneventful. The whispers occasionally returned, fainter now, more distant, but the woman didn't reappear. By dawn, I had reached the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and I felt an immense wave of relief wash over me as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. That harrowing night changed me in ways I still don't fully understand. Since then, I've taken different routes when possible, avoiding Dead Man's Pass, especially during storms. I keep the sent Christopher medallion with me on every trip, and I never drive when I'm too tired, no matter how tight the deadline. But the strangest thing happened about a year after my encounter. I was driving through Tennessee on a clear summer day when my brakes suddenly failed on a steep downgrade. By all rights, I should have crashed, but somehow I managed to use my engine brake and runaway ramp to stop safely. When the mechanic examined my truck later, he was astounded. "These brake lines didn't just fail," he told me. "They look like they were cut clean through. But it couldn't have happened while you were driving. You'd have lost brake pressure immediately, not gradually like you described." Was it a coincidence? Or had the lady in blue somehow intervened, giving me time to react before the complete failure? I'll never know for certain. It's been 7 years now since that night on Dead Man's Pass. I'm still driving, still covering thousands of miles across this vast country. And thankfully, I've never had any serious accidents like those other drivers warned me about. Every time I pass through a mountain range or navigate a dangerous curve, I touch the medallion and whisper a small word of thanks, both to St. Christopher and, perhaps, to a restless spirit in a pale blue dress, who might just be looking out for those of us who share her road. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened on that stormy night. Was she a ghost, a hallucination brought on by fatigue, or something else entirely? But one thing's for certain, I'll never forget those eyes, that whispered voice, or the bone-deep cold that no heater could touch. And whenever I hear other drivers tell similar tales, I don't laugh or dismiss them anymore. I just listen, nod, and remind them to drive carefully, especially on rainy nights in the mountains. Because sometimes, the legends of the road are more than just stories to keep us awake during those long, dark hours behind the wheel. Sometimes they're warnings, and sometimes, just maybe, they're attempts at connection from those who left this world too soon, still trying to find their way home. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Taraz, and I've been a long-haul trucker for many years. I've always been a quiet guy, the kind who doesn't look for trouble and just enjoys life. I know every road in Alaska like the back of my hand. I have a wonderful wife, Sophia, and 2 children, Mykola and Oksana, whom I'm very proud of. I always try to be present in their lives, despite my exhausting schedule as a driver. But there's one story that changed my life forever. It happened on a freezing winter night, while I was driving on a deserted road in Alaska. It was a very dark night, with only the northern lights and my truck headlights illuminating the way. I was already accustomed to the solitude of the roads, but that night I felt a strange chill down my spine. That's when I saw a child standing on the side of the road. She was alone, seemed lost, and I couldn't just drive by. I stopped the truck, my heart pounding. I had always wondered how I would react if I saw something like this. My son Mykola, who is 9 years old, always hugs me tightly when I return from a trip. And I couldn't help but think of him when I saw this vulnerable child. The girl had white hair and an empty gaze that sent shivers down my spine. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. The feeling that something was very wrong only intensified. When I turned back to get a flashlight, the girl had vanished. I searched everywhere around, but there was no trace, only the silence of the night and the sound of snow crunching beneath my feet. I returned to the truck, confused and a little scared. I decided to drive on, thinking that perhaps I was just too tired and was seeing things. But then something strange started happening. Every time I turned on the radio, I heard children's laughter as if it was coming from nowhere. I switched stations, turned off the radio, but the laughter grew louder and closer. I didn't know what to do. I stopped at several stations, asked for help, but nobody believed me. They said it was stress, fatigue, that I needed to rest. But I knew it wasn't that. Something had happened on that road, something I couldn't explain. Days passed and the laughter didn't stop. I could no longer sleep properly, eat, or concentrate on the road. That's when I decided I had to return to that place. I needed to understand what had happened. After finishing my delivery, I took my truck and drove back to that deserted road to try to find answers. When I got there, I stepped out of the cab and started looking for any clues, anything that might explain the presence of that child. I walked along the roadside, went into the forest, called out to her, but only the echo of my own voice responded. And then I noticed something glittering in the snow. It was a small medallion. It seemed antique, with a photograph inside. It was a photo of the girl I had seen on the road. I felt a chill and put the medallion in my pocket, then returned to the truck, determined to find out who this child was. Further down the road was a small town, almost a village. I decided to stop and talk to the locals. When I showed them the medallion with the photograph, no one recognized the girl until I showed it to an old woman. She was surprised and at the same time seemed frightened. She told me that the girl's name was Anna, and that many years had passed since she had last seen her. She told an old story about a family that disappeared in that area many years ago during a severe blizzard. Their youngest daughter, Anna, was never found, while the rest of the family perished from the cold. Could that child have been her? I was even more frightened by this story, a sad story of tragedy. I decided it was time to get out of there as quickly as possible. I thought all this would pass. I got into my truck and started driving, but the laughter continued, and now I felt that I was not alone. Something or someone was watching me, following my every step. After some time, at a stop in Alaska, while I was drinking coffee and stretching my legs a bit after a long drive, I heard other truckers talking about the same thing happening to them. One saw a girl on the road. She disappeared, and he began to hear laughter from nowhere. I realized I wasn't the only one, but I kept to myself. I didn't want to relive that story. Many believe it's just an urban legend, a story to scare travelers on the road. But for me, it was real as the laughter I still hear on my truck's radio, constantly reminding me of that night on the deserted road. Many years have passed now, and I still drive the roads of Alaska. That laughter has never completely stopped, but I've learned to live with it. Let me tell you another story that happened to me a few years ago. I'm a trucker, and I've always loved this life on the road, discovering new places and meeting different people. I spend more time in my truck than at home, and this has taught me to be smart and careful. It was one of those nights when you just want to find a quiet place to rest a bit. I had been driving for many hours, exhausted after a delivery in northern Montana. Fatigue was setting in, and my eyes could barely stay open. That's when I saw a place that seemed perfect for stopping and sleeping. It was an abandoned monastery with an old chapel and a large courtyard. There was no one around, and it seemed like the ideal place for a break. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and prepared to sleep. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of wind in the trees and the distant howling of coyotes. I thought it would be a peaceful night without problems. I stayed in the truck, looking at this gloomy place, pondering how many stories might be associated with it. But eventually, fatigue overcame curiosity, and I closed my eyes, hoping for a good night's sleep. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by strange sounds. It seemed as if someone was praying, and it wasn't an ordinary prayer. It sounded like a group of people, all murmuring simultaneously. The sound was quiet, but constant and echoed throughout the abandoned monastery. I lay there for a few minutes, trying to understand what was happening. Who in their right mind would come to such a place in the middle of the night to pray? My first reaction was to think that perhaps they were some locals, but the place seemed completely abandoned when I arrived. I slowly rose, trying to make as little noise as possible, and looked out the truck window. Outside, the moon ominously illuminated the monastery courtyard. And then I saw figures in hoods. They were slowly walking across the yard, moving in a row, as if in some kind of procession. My heart raced, and I felt goosebumps run down my back. I froze, not knowing if it was safe to go out to get a better look. Curiosity overcame fear. I grabbed a flashlight and got out of the truck, trying to make as little noise as possible. Each step was a challenge, as the ground, covered with an icy crust, seemed to amplify any sound. The hooded figures continued to walk around the courtyard, murmuring prayers that I couldn't make out well. They seemed to be speaking in some ancient language, something I had never heard before. I slowly approached, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light illuminated the path in front of me, but when I directed it at the figures, the light seemed to pass through them without illuminating them, as if they were made of shadow/content. This happened about 15 years ago, back when I drove the long hauls across the American Southwest. Name's Jack, and I've been trucking for more decades than I care to count. Seen just about every stretch of asphalt from Maine to California. Back then, satellite radio wasn't common in every cab like it is now. What we relied on was the CB radio, Citizens Band, a communication device that let drivers talk to each other on the open road. We used it to warn about speed traps, share information about road conditions, or just to have someone to talk to during those long, lonely nights. It was our lifeline when cell service was spotty at best. That particular night, I was hauling a load of electronics from Albuquerque heading west on Route 66. Yes, the historic one, though most of my route followed the newer Interstate 40 that had replaced it. Something about that old highway always gave me a strange feeling, like I was driving through the ghosts of America's past. I had just pulled out of a truck stop outside Gallup, New Mexico. The clock on my dash read 11:15, and there wasn't another soul on the road as far as I could see. I switched on the CB radio like I always did, scanning through the channels hoping to find some chatter to keep me alert. Nothing but static across all 40 channels. That wasn't too unusual for that time of night in such a remote area, but still, the silence felt heavier than normal. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, and the darkness seemed to press in against my windshield. I had settled on channel 19, the standard trucker channel, when I heard it. A voice, faint and distorted by static, like it was coming from very far away. "Can anybody hear me? Please? I need help." The voice sounded desperate, almost breathless. Something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. In our unwritten code of the road, you always try to help another driver in trouble. I picked up the handset and responded, "This is Jack, coming back at you. What's your 20? What kind of help you need?" But the moment I released the talk button, the channel went dead silent. Not even static. Just nothing. Like someone had cut the power to my radio, though the indicator light still showed it was on. I tried again, but my voice seemed to disappear into a void. I kept driving, trying to shake off the uneasiness that had settled over me. That call for help lingered in my mind. There was something unnatural about how quickly it had disappeared. I stayed on that channel, watching for any sign of transmission, expecting the voice to return. 10 miles down the road, the CB suddenly crackled to life again. This time the voice was even weaker, as though the person was fading away. "Please, someone, the turn-off by the red rocks." I pulled over immediately, turned up the volume all the way, and grabbed the mic. "Hey buddy, I hear you. Where exactly are you? What turn-off? What mile marker?" I waited, holding my breath. The static hissed and popped, and then so quiet I almost missed it. Cold. Getting so cold. "Please," then nothing. The silence that followed felt unnatural, almost solid. I tried responding several more times, but it was like shouting into a black hole. No response, not even an acknowledgement. Something wasn't right. I've been on these roads long enough to know when things feel off. I glanced at my GPS, trying to figure out if there was any turnoff with red rocks nearby. Nothing obvious showed up on the map. I decided to continue driving, keeping my eyes peeled for any turnoff or red rock formation. The clock now read 11:45, and the dark desert stretched endlessly around me. I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour. Suddenly the radio crackled again, louder this time, like the source was closer. "Help me, please." The voice sounded clearer now, and I realized with a chill that it wasn't coming through the speaker anymore. It seemed to be coming from inside my cab, surrounding me. My blood ran cold. "Jack," the voice whispered, and hearing my name spoken so intimately made my heart skip a beat. I had mentioned my name only once, briefly. "Who is this?" I demanded, no longer using the CB, but speaking directly into the air of my cab. "Where are you?" "The accident. 15 years ago. You drove past." My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. 15 years ago, I had been driving this same route, a young trucker still getting used to the long hauls. There had been a terrible accident. A car had gone off the road near some distinctive red rock formations. I remembered seeing the emergency lights as I drove past, but I hadn't stopped. I was on a tight schedule, and there were already responders on scene. At least that's what I told myself. The voice seemed to read my thoughts. "You saw me. You didn't stop." The dashboard lights began to flicker. My engine sputtered, despite the fuel gauge showing half full. The truck began to lose power, slowing down even as I pushed the accelerator to the floor. "I was still alive when you passed by," the voice said, no longer weak but clear and accusatory. "I could have been saved." My truck came to a complete stop, right in the middle of the highway. The engine died. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own ragged breathing. Then in the distance, I saw them. Red rock formations illuminated by moonlight that had suddenly broken through the clouds. And beside them, barely visible, was a small turnoff from the main highway. "You have a chance to help me now, Jack," the voice said, softer now. "Just like you had then." My GPS screen flickered and changed, showing a location I hadn't programmed, a point just off the highway by those red rocks. The digital clock on my dash no longer showed 11:58. It now displayed 3:17 a.m. Exactly the time of the accident 15 years ago, if my memory served correctly. With trembling hands, I tried to restart the engine. Nothing happened. The voice came again, from everywhere and nowhere. "Will you help me this time, Jack?" I don't know what came over me, fear, guilt, or maybe a desperate need for this nightmare to end. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the truck. The night air was unnaturally cold for New Mexico, even in spring. My breath fogged in front of me as I walked toward the red rocks, my flashlight beam cutting weakly through the darkness. The turnoff was barely visible. An old access road that wasn't on any modern maps, probably a remnant of the original Route 66. As I approached the rocks, my flashlight began to flicker, then went out completely. But I didn't need it anymore. There in the darkness was a faint blue glow, and as I got closer, I could make out the outline of a car crushed against the rocks, as if the accident was happening in slow motion before my eyes. I could see someone inside, moving weakly. "I'm here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm here to help this time." What happened next is difficult to explain. The blue glow enveloped me, and for a moment, I felt like I was in two places at once, standing by the rocks in the present, and 15 years in the past, reaching out to pull someone from a wreck before it was too late. I felt a cold hand grasp mine, heard a whispered "thank you," and then the vision collapsed. I found myself on my knees beside the red rocks, alone in the dark. My flashlight suddenly came back on, illuminating nothing but desert scrub and sand. When I made it back to my truck, the engine started on the first try. The dashboard clock showed 12:34 a.m. Normal time had resumed. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I continued my route that night, shaken to my core. When I reached Flagstaff the next morning, I asked some of the local truckers if they knew anything about an accident by the Red Rocks 15 years ago. Most just shrugged, but one old-timer looked at me strangely. "You know," he said, "there was a nasty wreck out that way back then. Young woman went off the road, wasn't found until morning. Story goes she might have survived if she'd been found sooner." I've made that same run countless times since then, but I've never heard that voice on my CB again. I did, however, start volunteering with the Highway Patrol Auxiliary, helping to spot accidents and call in emergency services. Some debts can never fully be repaid, but I figure it's a start. And every time I pass those red rocks on Route 66, I slow down and flash my lights, just to let them know I haven't forgotten, and that this time I'm paying attention. That night I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains, making a long-haul delivery to a mining town tucked away in the hills of West Virginia. The year was 1987, before cell phones and GPS systems made isolation less frightening. The moon hung full in the sky, casting silver light across the winding mountain roads, and the static from the AM radio was my only companion. My 18-wheeler hummed steadily as I navigated the empty route, feeling that particular kind of alone that only night drivers understand. As I rounded a hairpin turn nicknamed Devil's Elbow by the locals, I spotted something on the shoulder, a semi-truck with its hazard lights blinking rhythmically into the darkness. Being a trucker myself, I knew the unwritten code of the road. You don't leave another driver stranded. Those mountain passes could be dangerous, especially in the dead of night when temperatures dropped and wildlife ventured onto the asphalt. I eased my rig to a stop about 50 yards ahead and climbed down from my cab, the cold mountain air immediately biting at my face. What I noticed right away was peculiar. There wasn't a soul around. The truck's engine was still warm. I could feel the heat rising from the hood, but the cab was empty, door firmly shut, hazard lights pulsing in perfect intervals. I checked underneath, walked around to the trailer, even called out a few times, my voice echoing across the valley below. Nothing. No footprints in the soft shoulder dirt. No signs of struggle. Just an abandoned truck on a desolate mountain road. I remember thinking the driver must have hitched a ride with someone else to find help, though leaving the hazards on seemed wasteful for the battery. I returned to my truck and continued driving, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine. The abandoned truck nagged at my thoughts. Something wasn't right. In my rearview mirror, I could still see those blinking hazards growing smaller in the distance, until they were just pinpricks of light in the blackness behind me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Those distant lights were getting larger, not smaller. I squinted at my mirror, thinking my tired mind was playing tricks, but there was no denying it. The truck that had been stationary was now moving, following me. My first thought was rational. The driver had returned and was continuing his journey. But when I really focused on the approaching vehicle, I realized there was nobody behind the wheel. The cab was empty, illuminated briefly by passing moonlight between the trees, but the truck maintained a perfect line down the center of its lane. Panic gripped me as I pressed harder on the accelerator. My rig responded sluggishly on the incline, but I managed to increase my speed. The phantom truck behind me matched my pace exactly, maintaining the same distance between us, neither gaining nor falling behind. It was as if it were tethered to my vehicle by some invisible force. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a narrow ribbon of asphalt carved into the mountainside with no turnoffs in sight. Dense forest pressed in from both sides, and a steep drop-off to my right meant there was nowhere to pull over, nowhere to escape. Just me, my truck, and this thing pursuing me through the Appalachian night. I watched in my mirror as the truck's headlights suddenly extinguished, leaving only the hazard lights blinking. But the truck didn't slow down. It continued forward in perfect silence, as if gliding across the pavement. My CB radio, which had been playing trucker chatter and country music, dissolved into static, growing louder with each passing second, until I had to shut it off completely. The temperature in my cab plummeted. I could see my breath clouding in front of me, despite the heater running at full blast. The windows began to fog, and ice crystals formed in delicate patterns along the edges of the glass. My hands, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, began to ache with cold. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill. I tried changing speeds randomly, accelerating suddenly, then braking. But the phantom truck adjusted instantly, maintaining that same precise distance. It was toying with me, like a predator stalking its prey before the kill. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes of this supernatural pursuit, I came to a decision. Running wasn't working. I gradually eased off the accelerator, my heart hammering in my chest as I prepared for whatever would happen next. As my speed decreased, I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The truck behind me disappeared. One moment it was there, hazard lights blinking in that hypnotic rhythm, and the next, nothing. just empty roads stretching behind me, bathed in moonlight. I pulled over immediately, hands shaking so badly I could barely set the brake. I stumbled from the cab and stared back down the road, but there was no sign of the other vehicle. It had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Something else caught my attention, a strange marking carved into a nearby guardrail. It looked like a crude figure 8 lying on its side, the symbol for infinity. It seemed freshly cut, the exposed metal gleaming in the moonlight. I ran my fingers over it, feeling a strange vibration, almost like a low-frequency hum. I climbed back into my truck, disturbed but determined to complete my delivery. The engine, which had been running smoothly all night, now sputtered and coughed as if struggling for breath. The dashboard lights flickered erratically, and the needle on my temperature gauge swung wildly from cold to overheating and back again. There was a truck stop about 15 miles ahead according to my map, and I decided to pull in there, both to check my rig and to clear my head. The place was mostly deserted at that hour, just a couple of long-haul drivers nursing coffee at the counter. I took a seat next to an older man with a weathered face and hands that told the story of decades on the road. After ordering coffee, I casually asked if he knew anything about Devil's Elbow, trying not to sound as shaken as I felt. The man set down his mug slowly, fixing me with a penetrating stare. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. "The phantom 18-wheeler. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning. The man didn't wait for my answer. "It happened back in '68, he continued. "A trucker named Marcus Weldon was hauling explosives for the coal mines. Story goes that he took that curve too fast in heavy fog, went straight through the guardrail. They never found his body, never recovered the truck. Should have been at the bottom of the ravine, but search and rescue said it was like they'd vanished into thin air." He paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee. The strange part is, his manifest showed he was carrying exactly 8 crates of dynamite. Ever since then, people report seeing a truck on that stretch. Always at night, always with its hazards on. "But why would it follow me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old trucker's eyes met mine, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected, not fear, but a deep sadness. "Some say he's looking for his way home. Others think he's trying to warn drivers about the curve. But a few old-timers believe he's searching for 8 souls to replace the 8 crates he lost, like some kind of cosmic balance sheet that needs settling." He pulled up his sleeve, revealing a small tattoo of the infinity symbol on his forearm. I saw it too, back in '75. Been carrying this reminder ever since. A promise that I'd never forget what I saw, and that I'd warn others. I left the truck stop feeling more unsettled than before. The rest of my journey to the mining town was uneventful, and I delivered my cargo on time the next morning. After unloading, I took a mandatory rest period, but sleep wouldn't come. All I could think about was the return journey and having to pass through Devil's Elbow again. When the time came to head back, I seriously considered taking a detour, a longer route that would add almost 100 miles to my trip, but would avoid that cursed curve. In the end, professional pride won out. I couldn't let one inexplicable experience, however terrifying, dictate my route choices. Besides, it was daytime now. Surely whatever haunted that stretch of road was a creature of the night. As I approached the area, however, the bright afternoon suddenly darkened as storm clouds rolled in with unnatural speed. Rain began to lash against my windshield, and fog rose from the valley below, curling around my truck like spectral fingers. By the time I reached Devil's Elbow, conditions had deteriorated to near zero visibility, eerily similar to the conditions described in Marcus Weldon's Fatal Accident. As I carefully navigated the curve, my truck suddenly lurched toward the guardrail, as if pulled by an invisible force. It took all my strength to wrench the steering wheel in the opposite direction. That's when I saw it in my peripheral vision. A ghostly figure seated beside me in the passenger seat. A man in outdated work clothes with a haunted expression. His lips moved soundlessly, and though no words reached my ears, somehow I understood what he was trying to communicate. 8 souls or 8 warnings. You've received your first. 7 more chances to heed the message. And then he was gone, and my truck was firmly back in its lane, the steering once again responding normally to my touch. The storm cleared as suddenly as it had appeared, sunshine breaking through as if nothing unusual had happened. In my rearview mirror, I could see Devil's Elbow receding behind me, and for just a moment, I thought I glimpsed 8 small lights hovering above the curve, arranged in that familiar infinity pattern. I've changed my route since then, finding reasons to avoid that particular stretch of Appalachian Highway. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night and see hazard lights blinking in the distance, I feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine. And I wonder, was that my first warning of 8? And if so, what happens when the count reaches 0? Some nights, I swear I can feel Marcus Weldon riding beside me, patiently waiting for me to return to Devil's Elbow one final time. And sometimes, when I check my logbook, I notice strange entries I don't remember making, all routes that would take me back to that curve, as if something is trying to guide me there, to complete whatever mysterious transaction began on that moonlit night in the mountains. I've told this story to exactly 7 other truckers over the years. You're the 8th. Maybe that means something, maybe it doesn't. But if you're ever driving through the Appalachians at night and see a truck pulled over with its hazards on, just keep going. Some strangers aren't meant to be helped, and some curves weren't meant to be taken twice. I was halfway through one of those long hauls that come with the territory when you drive an 18-wheeler across the Midwest. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:15 in the morning, and I'd been on the road since noon the previous day. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the moonlight, empty, except for the occasional pair of headlights moving in the opposite direction. The isolation didn't bother me. After 15 years on the road, you get used to the solitude. I was just looking forward to reaching that truck stop in Oak Ridge, about 30 miles ahead. I knew they had decent showers, a half-decent diner that served breakfast all night, and those memory foam mattresses in the sleeping quarters that were a godsend for my aching back. The journey had been surprisingly smooth so far. My rig was running fine. The weather was clear despite the forecast warning of potential thunderstorms, and I'd managed to avoid the construction zones that typically plagued this stretch of I-80. but something felt off. Maybe it was the unusual stillness of the night, or the way the moonlight cast strange shadows across the farmland on either side of the highway. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, despite the empty road stretching for miles ahead and behind me. Just road fatigue, I muttered to myself, cranking up the volume on my satellite radio to drown out the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. That's when my headlights caught something unexpected in the middle of the road. A small figure standing motionless on the yellow line. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest as I slammed on the brakes, the truck's air horn blaring into the night. The rig shuddered and groaned as it came to a stop, and I found myself staring at something impossible. A child, a boy no more than 10 years old, standing in the middle of Interstate 80 at 3 in the morning. He wore outdated clothes, overalls with a red flannel shirt underneath that reminded me of those Depression-era photographs, and his face was unnaturally pale in the harsh glare of my headlights. But it was his eyes that disturbed me most. They seemed patient, like he'd been waiting a long time for someone, for me, to come along. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and climbed down from the cab. The night was unnaturally quiet. Even the usual chorus of crickets and distant highway sounds seemed muted. "Hey, kid, you okay?" My voice echoed across the empty fields on either side of the highway. "Where are your parents? What are you doing out here?" The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those unnerving eyes. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on the asphalt. When I was about 20 feet away, I noticed something else odd. Despite the cool night air, I couldn't see his breath. And then, between one step and the next, he was gone. Not like he'd run away or ducked down. He simply wasn't there anymore. One moment, I was looking at a boy in Depression-era clothes, and the next, I was staring at empty asphalt. I stood frozen, sweeping my flashlight beam across the highway and the ditches on either side. Nothing, no movement in the tall grass, no sound of footsteps running away. Just the distant hoot of an owl and the cooling tick of my truck's engine. "What the hell?" I whispered, my words hanging in the air. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe I dozed off for a microsecond. One of those highway hypnosis moments they warn you about in driver training. But I knew better. I'd been wide awake, alert from the coffee I'd downed at my last stop. I climbed back into my rig, hands trembling slightly as I turned the key. The familiar rumble of the engine was comforting. But as I pulled back onto the highway, that feeling of being watched intensified. The road ahead seemed longer somehow, the darkness deeper between the pools of light cast by the occasional street lamp. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see. I don't know what, but when I finally did see something, my blood turned to ice. The boy was there, running behind my truck, keeping pace, despite the fact that I was doing 65 miles per hour. His expression remained unchanged, those patient eyes fixed on me as his small legs moved with impossible speed. I floored the accelerator, pushing the rig to 70, then 75, watching with growing horror as the child maintained his pace effortlessly. Then, just as suddenly as before, he vanished. "This isn't happening," I said aloud, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "This is not happening. but it was. And what happened next convinced me that whatever was occurring was beyond any rational explanation. As the lights of the Oak Ridge truck stop came into view in the distance, a welcome sight that promised safety, normality, human contact, I spotted a familiar figure standing on the shoulder of the road. The boy again, waiting patiently, those eyes following my truck as I approached. This time, as I drove past, he turned his head to maintain eye contact with me through the passenger window. And then I'll never forget this detail. He smiled. Not a child's innocent smile, but something knowing and ancient that had no place on a young face. I pulled into the truck stop, with my heart hammering against my ribs, and practically ran into the main building. The place was almost empty at that hour, with just a couple of other drivers nursing cups of coffee at the counter, and a bored-looking cashier stocking cigarettes behind the register. The night manager, his name tag-read Earl, looked up as I burst in. Something in my expression must have alarmed him. "You all right, buddy? Look like you've seen a ghost," he said, putting down the inventory sheet he'd been working on. I told him what had happened, the words tumbling out in a rush. I expected skepticism, maybe even laughter, but Earl's weathered face grew increasingly serious as I spoke. When I finished, he sighed deeply and reached under the counter, pulling out a worn leather-bound book. He flipped it open to a page marked with a faded red ribbon. "You're not the first," he said quietly, turning the book around to show me a newspaper clipping from 1957. The yellowed headline read, "Local boy killed in highway tragedy." The accompanying photograph showed a solemn-faced child in overalls and a flannel shirt. "That's the Miller boy," Earl explained. Story goes that he was walking home from school when a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. Hit him right on what's now I-80, though it was just Route 6 back then. Every few years, someone comes in here with a story just like yours. Always around this time of year, the anniversary of his death. Earl turned a few more pages, showing me handwritten accounts dating back decades, all describing similar encounters. Some drivers reported seeing the boy in the middle of the road. Others spotted him running alongside their vehicles at impossible speeds. All mentioned those unnerving, patient eyes. "Why me?" I asked, a chill running down my spine despite the truck stop's overheated interior. "Why does he appear to some drivers and not others?" Earl shrugged, closing the book. "No one knows for sure. Some say he's looking for the driver who killed him. The man was never identified. Others think he's trying to warn drivers to stay alert, prevent the same tragedy from happening again." He paused, then added more quietly, "And some believe he's not trying to warn anyone at all, that he's looking for company." I barely slept that night, even in the relative safety of the truck stop's sleeping quarters. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that unnatural smile, those ancient eyes in a child's face. The next morning, I changed my route, taking a longer path that avoided that stretch of I-80 entirely. That was 7 years ago. I've never been back to Oak Ridge, never driven that particular section of highway again. But sometimes, on long night drives when the road is empty and the moon is bright, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see a small figure in the distance, waiting patiently for me to pass. They say that stretch of I-80 has one of the lowest accident rates in the country now. Maybe because drivers are being more careful. Or maybe because someone is watching over them, ensuring they stay awake, stay alert, stay alive. At least that's what I tell myself when I wake up from the nightmares. Growing up in rural Vermont, I heard countless stories about Highway 107, a winding mountain road that cuts through the densest parts of the Green Mountains. But I never believed them until I experienced the horrors myself. It was a frigid December night when my grandmother and I were driving back from Burlington. The snow was falling lightly, creating that hypnotic pattern in the headlights. We were about halfway home when we noticed something strange up ahead. A lone figure hunched over a bicycle on the side of the road. "Poor soul," my grandmother muttered, "broken down in this weather." As we approached, I could see it was a man trying to fix the chain on his bicycle. Something seemed off about his movements, jerky, unnatural. When our headlights fully illuminated him, my blood turned colder than the winter air outside. Each time he bent down to work on the chain, his head, it split open, right down the middle, like a ripe watermelon cut in two. When he straightened up, the halves would seamlessly close again. Down he'd bend, and open it would split. Up he'd rise, and closed it would become. My grandmother gasped, and immediately began reciting the Lord's Prayer. The driver, my Uncle Robert, grabbed the rosary hanging from his rearview mirror and clutched it tightly. We drove past as quickly as the icy roads would allow, and I looked back through the rear window to see that thing, still there, still trying to fix its bicycle chain, still splitting its head open and closed. But that wasn't the only ghost haunting Highway 107. There were rumors of a motorcyclist with a glowing forehead who drove on the wrong side of the road, forcing vehicles off the pavement. One of his victims was old Mr. Harrison, a beloved taxi driver from our town. Everyone trusted Mr. Harrison with his pristine yellow Chevrolet that he'd maintained since the 70s. He drove slowly and carefully, which is why everyone was shocked when his taxi was found wrapped around a telephone pole one October night. Before he died from his injuries, trapped in the twisted metal of his beloved car, Mr. Harrison told the first responders that a motorcycle with a rider who had a light shining from his forehead had come straight at him on the wrong side. To avoid a collision, he'd swerved off the road. The ambulance took too long to arrive, and Mr. Harrison died there on Highway 107. A month later, another incident occurred. A young motorcyclist encountered the same phantom rider. He too swerved to avoid a collision, but crashed through a barbed wire fence. People who stopped to help described a scene too horrific for me to recount in detail. The man was entangled in the barbed wire, his wounds grievous, his screams echoing through the mountains. By the time paramedics arrived, they couldn't save him. Now his ghost adds to the highway's reputation. Drivers report hearing agonized screams near mile marker 23, and some claim to see the gruesome image of a man hanging upside down in a fence, still crying out in pain. Hikers and those who walk along the highway's shoulder say the moans are loudest just before sunrise. But the supernatural occurrences didn't stop there. During the spring thaw of last year, 2 women were walking home from a community dance along the highway's shoulder. A massive logging truck suddenly veered off the road and struck them both. The driver, visibly shaken but unharmed, told responding officers. He had been completely sober and alert when a motorcyclist with a glowing forehead appeared, heading straight for him in the wrong lane. I had to swerve, he explained, trembling. I saw those women, but I couldn't stop in time. After hours of searching, emergency services found the bodies of both women. And now, according to local lore, these women joined the highway's ghostly residents. Truck drivers frequently report picking up 2 silent female hitchhikers along that stretch. They barely speak during the ride, but always eventually say, "We live just up ahead." When the trucks slow down, the drivers find nothing. No house, no driveway, not even a mailbox. When they turn to their passengers, the women have vanished, and the only marker of their existence is 2 wooden crosses standing side by side just off the shoulder. The crosses are still there today. I've seen them. Things intensified when a spiritual medium named Samuel opened a small sanctuary near my family's property. At first, it seemed harmless ceremonies with drums and singing that we could hear from our porch on summer evenings. But soon the tone changed. During their rituals, participants began channeling spirits of those who had died on Highway 107. These spirits begged for water or screamed in agony, reliving their final moments. Drawn by the candles Samuel would light along the roadside, more lost souls began to appear at his ceremonies. Not all were benevolent. Some began manifesting in nearby homes, including ours. At night, we'd hear footsteps moving through our house, even though everyone was accounted for in their beds. Moans and whispers echoed through our hallways. Objects would be moved when no one was looking. Samuel eventually admitted defeat. "In all my years," he told my father, "I've never encountered a place with so many restless spirits. This highway holds them all, trapped in their final moments." But even before Samuel arrived, supernatural occurrences were common in houses near Highway 107. Every resident has a story of something seen or heard on dark nights along that road. I've collected dozens of these tales, each one more chilling than the last, and all absolutely true. Many locals avoid this highway entirely now, especially after dark. The stories eventually reached Bishop Thornton, who sent Father Michael to investigate. After spending just one night near the highway, Father Michael ordered the construction of St. Catherine's Chapel on a small hill overlooking the road. Strangely enough, people passing the chapel at night report hearing prayers being recited inside, even when the building is empty and locked. Some say it's Father Michael, still trying to bring peace to the restless souls of Highway 107. This is the true account of the most haunted highway in Vermont. If you ever find yourself driving those winding mountain roads after sunset, keep your eyes fixed straight ahead. Don't stop for any reason. And whatever you do, don't pick up any hitchhikers. May God grant those souls peace. Hey there, folks. The name's Hank Dawson, 67 years old, born and raised in the small town of Pineville, Montana. These days I run a modest general store in town, but for nearly 30 years, I was a long-haul trucker, crisscrossing this great country of ours. I've been from Maine to California, Texas to Washington, and even made runs up to Alaska and down to Mexico on occasion. During those years on the road, I saw things that would make even the toughest person shiver in their boots. But there's one experience that made me hang up my keys for good and open this little store I have today. For the longest time, I felt uneasy sharing this story. Even now, more than 25 years after it happened, I feel a knot in my throat and chills down my spine when I recall that night. But I think it's important for folks to know that there are things out on those highways that defy explanation. There's ancient evil lurking out there, dark, tenebrous creatures. Supernatural dangers walk along those shoulders in forms so strange that not even the most creative horror writer could imagine them. It all began in the early winter of 2001, December to be exact. It was a challenging time for the country after the September attacks, but also a time filled with resilience and hope. I had received a job to transport a shipment of cattle to a slaughterhouse. Since it was live cargo, it had to be handled with extreme care. The plan was to leave before dawn on a Wednesday from northern Wyoming and drive straight through to my destination in southern Colorado, arriving by early Friday morning. I'd only stopped to refuel and rest for a few hours in the evenings when the temperature dropped and the animals needed to be checked on. Everything started smoothly. The price was agreed upon, the route mapped out, and with my truck loaded, I set off with the animals. For those unfamiliar with the northern Rockies in winter, everything is distant and isolated. The nearest towns can be 100, 200, sometimes 300 miles apart, and the roads, even today, can be treacherous. Now imagine back then, narrow passages through mountain passes, improvised wooden bridges, and routes cutting through vast wilderness areas and isolated ranches. Not to mention the sudden blizzards that could strand you for days. It's worth mentioning that many drivers refused to take jobs during that particular week because it was the winter solstice, and especially because the delivery date would fall on a Friday, the 13th. I initially declined the job myself, but the pay was substantial, much higher than the normal rate, and that caught my attention. Little did I know I was about to face one of the most terrifying experiences a human being could endure. On the agreed date and time, I fired up that diesel engine, turned on my radio to some classic country, and departed, alert, but not before saying a prayer asking for protection. I've always been deeply devoted to Saint Christopher, came from a religious family, and I know that faith helped me through many close calls during my years on the road. I've escaped robberies, accidents, animals appearing suddenly on the highway, everything you can imagine. I've been delivered from. And I'm certain it was thanks to Saint Christopher's protection and the Lord's grace. I even had a medallion of him on my dashboard, which I still keep in my store to this day. I was traveling alone, except for a parrot named Rusty, a foul-mouthed bird that always made me laugh when he started cursing whenever someone entered the cab. He would always greet people with, "Let's roll, ugly mug." I had taught him that as a joke for my fellow truckers, since on longer hauls we often traveled in pairs. The early morning was bitterly cold, with fog covering the mountain roads, forcing me to double my attention. But as the sun gradually took command, the temperature rose and daylight cleared away the fog. Wednesday passed without incident. It was the 12th, and I've always been somewhat superstitious. knowing that the following day would be Friday the 13th. I stopped at a small chapel in one of the towns along the way and collected some holy water. Better safe than sorry, as they say. Thursday was uneventful. The temperature was pleasant, and I decided not to stop during midday. Just continue my journey, calculating that if I drove straight through, I could arrive by early Friday morning instead of later in the day. I was well rested and fed, so there was no risk of falling asleep at the wheel. I'd done this kind of marathon drive before and felt confident. And that's when everything changed. It was the early morning hours of Thursday turning into Friday, around 3 o'clock. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically, and my radio stopped working, nothing but static on all channels. I found it strange since I'd passed through this area before and never experienced anything like it. But I clung to my faith and continued praying. To my dismay, the fog had returned, forcing me to reduce my speed and increase my vigilance. I was approaching roughly a 120-mile stretch of straight road, a section where accidents can happen because when the road is that straight, it's easy to fall into a hypnotic state, and that almost always leads to trouble. It's not uncommon to doze off without realizing it. Your eyes are open, but suddenly you glance at the clock and see that 15 or 20 minutes have passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. We truckers called it fishing, like nodding off while fishing. I've seen buddies beside me who nearly crashed without me even noticing they were asleep until I heard them snoring. The poor fella dozed off with his eyes open and let the truck drift into the oncoming lane. I grabbed the wheel and he woke up startled, but thankfully the fright didn't cause an accident. It's terrifying to see a 20-ton steel monster out of control, a sure recipe for tragedy. I started praying aloud so it wouldn't happen to me, and the cattle in the back, which had been silent until now, began making noises as if joining me in prayer. It was a strange sound, almost like a lament or a cry, something I'd never heard before that sent chills down my spine. I took the St. Christopher medallion from the glove compartment and placed it on the dashboard, asking for protection. That's when I saw someone on the shoulder, a woman walking in the opposite direction. She was dressed entirely in white and was pointing to the side of the road as if trying to show me something. I didn't stop, I just tried to ignore her. A woman in white during the dead of night on a desolate mountain road is certainly not of this world, especially in a place where there was nothing but wilderness and highway. I continued praying and glanced at the clock. It was 3:33 in the morning. They say that's the witching hour, and after what I experienced, I don't doubt it. I continued down the road for several more minutes when, to my shock and terror, the same woman appeared walking along the roadside. It wasn't another woman in white. It was the same one, making the same gesture. I tried to ignore her, but the sensation of dread began to grow inside me. I checked the clock again, still 3:33, which was impossible since several minutes had passed between the first and second sightings. I continued my journey, and the woman appeared again. I accelerated a bit and still saw her 3 more times. Each time I looked at the dashboard clock, it showed 3:33. That's when I heard something behind me. It was Rusty saying, "Let's roll, ugly mug." Something he always said when someone entered the cab. My whole body was covered in goosebumps, but I didn't turn around or look in the rearview mirror. You know that feeling when you sense someone is behind you? That's exactly what I felt. A fear so intense it nearly paralyzed me. But something told me I shouldn't turn around, no matter what happened. Rusty continued talking, but his voice wasn't the animated tone parrots usually have. It was sinister, as if he himself was terrified by what he saw. I resumed praying, louder this time. My faith was my shield, and whatever was in there with me wouldn't harm me if I continued my prayer. The cold intensified, and the fog grew even thicker. Even with the high beams on, I could barely see a few yards ahead. A slow, labored breathing approached my ear. The smell of decay and death filled the entire cab. I could feel the thing very close to my neck, with its demonic, icy breath. "Ugly mug," Rusty repeated, as if warning me of what awaited. The clock still showed the same time, and I began to panic, which worsened when I heard the thing whisper in my ear. "Son, aren't you going to turn around and look at me?" it asked. And it was my father's voice. I recognized it immediately. The problem was my father had passed away more than 20 years before. I reduced my speed even more as the fog thickened. Now trembling, with tears in my eyes and a mouth dry from fear, I gradually pulled onto the shoulder and turned on the hazard lights. Slowly, I opened the truck door and stepped onto the frozen gravel of the roadside. I took a cigarette from my pocket and lit it with difficulty, as my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I looked toward the forest beside the road and saw numerous red eyes hidden in the darkness. It was either stay there with them or inside with that thing. I prayed quietly now, asking God for strength to endure this trial. And in the distance, walking along the shoulder, I saw the same woman coming toward me in her white dress. I could clearly see her face now, her ghostly pallor, and the long, straight hair falling over her shoulders. I thought about running, but where to? There was no way to leave on foot, and no way to drive with that thing inside the truck. And the woman in white was approaching slowly, pointing toward the forest as she walked. She glided as if not touching the ground, but her immense dress didn't allow me to see her feet. "Let's roll, ugly mug," the parrot repeated. "Hello, is everything okay with your father?" said the thing in the cab. And the eyes in the forest were even brighter now, watching me. I decided to look in the direction the woman was pointing and saw small white lights that trembled. They were countless, like candle flames in a procession. Gradually, I heard an unintelligible chanting emerging from the fog. A procession appeared. The woman, who was now just a few feet from me, whispered as she passed by my side, "Lie down under the truck and hide." The cold was now almost unbearable, and without thinking twice, I obeyed. I lay down beneath the truck and watched as skeletal feet passed by me and stopped, surrounding the truck. The chanting grew louder, incomprehensible. Some of those things opened the door and entered the cab. Others climbed into the trailer, to the horror of the cattle, which mooed in terror. My parrot kept repeating, "Let's roll, ugly mug. Let's roll, ugly mug. Let's roll, ugly mug," like a mantra, until suddenly he stopped as if choking mid-sentence. The cattle now screamed as if human voices were coming from their mouths, voices filled with pain and terror. I'll never forget that sound even if I live another 1,000 years. I hope I never witness anything like it again. I remained there, lying with my head practically buried in the snow, for at least half an hour until everything fell silent. The fog gradually dissipated, and the eyes in the forest vanished like some macabre magic trick. I didn't immediately emerge from my hiding place. I waited longer, and when a car passed on the highway, I found the courage to get up. I was alone, dirty, and trembling on the dark shoulder of the road. I went to check on the cargo and see if the cattle were still there. They were, but their hides were all marked and scratched, with wounds that looked like they'd been made by claws. Blood dripped from the cuts, and they now stood in silence with empty eyes, as if staring into the void. I decided to push on. I entered the cab to find my parrot dead. The clock now read 3:43, and the radio suddenly turned on by itself, playing an old country ballad at full volume, which nearly made me jump out of my skin. I started the truck and continued, still praying, begging God for this cursed journey to end soon, and for everything to be all right in the end. When I reached my destination, I still had to listen to many complaints from the cargo owner about the condition of the animals. I didn't say anything. After all, who would believe me? I simply accepted the payment deduction and returned home, grateful to God, Saint Christopher, and the Lord for delivering me from yet another perilous situation. After that, I became disillusioned with the profession. I sold my truck and opened a small general store. I never returned to trucking, and during the winter solstice, I always close the shop, give my employees time off, and head to the Florida coast. To this day, I wonder what happened that night, but I prefer not to know. Some things are better left undisturbed. Of all this, what I regret most is the death of my companion, the parrot Rusty. What terrible force is capable of frightening an animal to death? We don't know, and ignorance is often the greatest blessing a person can have. Thank you for listening to my story. I've been driving big rigs across the country for about 7 years now. There's something about the open road that gets in your blood, the endless highways, the changing landscapes, the solitude. Most folks don't understand the appeal, but for me, it's a lifestyle I've grown to love. That said, this job isn't without its moments that make your skin crawl. Let me tell you about something that happened to me last winter, during that brutal cold snap that hit the Midwest. I was hauling a shipment of electronics from Chicago to Denver, fighting through some nasty weather. A major snowstorm had just blown through Colorado, and the highways were finally reopened after being shut down for nearly 2 days. I was behind schedule and trying to make up time. Around midnight, I pulled into this truck stop just outside Omaha. Now normally, these places are bustling with activity, truckers coming and going, the diner full of people grabbing a hot meal. But this place was eerily quiet. Only 4 or 5 trucks scattered across a lot built for 50. The gas station portion was connected to a rest area for regular vehicles, but even that was mostly deserted. After parking, I locked up and trudged through the snow to use the facilities and grab some food. The hot shower felt amazing after hours of driving through the bitter cold. Steam filled the small bathroom as I washed away the road grime, taking my time since there wasn't a line of drivers waiting. When I got back to my rig, I climbed into the cab, cranked up the heat, and settled in with my sandwich and coffee. I watched a couple of episodes of a crime documentary on my tablet, ironically, about highway disappearances. before finally feeling my eyelids getting heavy around 1:30 in the morning. I shut everything down, set my alarm for 6, and tucked my phone under my pillow. My sleeper cab is pretty comfortable. A twin-sized mattress, some storage compartments built into the walls, and blackout curtains that separate it from the driver's area. Once I killed the lights, it was pitch black inside. The only sounds were the occasional rumble of a passing truck and the soft hum of my heater. I was just drifting off when I heard it. A faint scratching sound. At first, I thought it might be ice or snow shifting on the roof of the cab. But then I heard it again, more deliberate, almost like fingernails lightly dragging across fabric. I froze, suddenly wide awake, straining my ears in the darkness. The sound stopped, and for a moment I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the truck settling, or the wind playing tricks. Then I heard what sounded like shallow breathing. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my cab. I lay perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound seemed to be coming from my storage compartment, a narrow closet-like space built into the wall of the sleeper, where I keep my clothes and personal items. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly sat up, trying not to make the mattress creak. The breathing had stopped, but now I could hear the slightest rustle of movement. I reached under my pillow for my phone, fumbling in the dark. My fingers found it, and I quickly activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and I pointed it toward the storage compartment. The door was closed, just as I'd left it. But now I was certain the sounds were coming from inside. With my other hand, I reached for the knife I keep in the side pocket next to my bed. Clutching it tightly, I slid out of bed and stood up, the cold floor shocking my bare feet. "I know someone's in there," I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'm armed. Come out now." Silence. I stepped closer, phone in one hand, knife in the other. When I was about 3 feet away, I heard a soft thump from inside the compartment. "Last chance," I warned. "I'm calling the police." With a quick motion, I yanked open the door, ready to defend myself. The beam of light illuminated a figure crouched inside. A woman with wild, matted hair hanging over her face. She was wearing a tattered coat that looked like it had been through hell. For a split second, our eyes met, and what I saw in hers wasn't aggression, but something more disturbing, a vacant, almost feral look. Before I could react, she lunged forward, not at me but past me, throwing something at my face. It was my own woolen cap. As I flinched, she scrambled past, knocking over my coffee thermos and sending it clattering across the floor. "Hey," I shouted, turning to follow her. She darted toward the front of the cab, moving with surprising agility for someone who'd been crammed into a small space. As she reached for the door handle, I noticed something clutched in her other hand, my wallet, which I'd left in the cup holder. "Stop," I yelled, lunging forward. She yanked the door open, letting in a blast of frigid air and swirling snow. For a moment she paused, looking back at me with those empty eyes. Then she tossed something else at me, a small object that glinted in the dim light. My house key, which she'd taken from my keyring, but left the truck keys behind. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "Check behind the mirrors." Then she was gone, leaping from the cab and disappearing into the snowy darkness. I stood there in shock, the cold air jolting me fully awake. I slammed the door shut and locked it, then frantically checked my entire cab, looking under the bed, behind the curtains, everywhere. I was alone again, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. My wallet lay open on the floor where she dropped it. I checked it. My cash and cards were untouched. Nothing seemed to be missing, except that single house key, which now lay on the floor where she'd thrown it. What did she mean about checking behind the mirrors? Was it just the ramblings of someone not right in the head, or something more? With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, checking around my truck. When I shined the light behind my side mirror, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small tracking device, no bigger than a quarter, magnetically attached to the metal frame. I pried it off and stomped it into the snow. To this day, I don't know if that woman was trying to rob me, was running from something, or was actually trying to warn me. I never reported it. What would I say? That a woman hiding in my truck possibly saved me from being tracked by someone with unknown intentions. 3 things changed after that night. First, I installed a small battery-powered motion detector in my sleeper cab. Second, I checked my entire rig, inside and out, before settling in for the night. And third, I never, ever assume that I'm alone on the road, even when it seems like I am. The highways connect more than just cities. They connect stories, lives, and sometimes dangers we never see coming. Stay safe out there, and always check behind your mirrors. About 5 years ago, I was working as a long-haul trucker on the East Coast. It was a job I held for almost 4 years, and I loved the sense of freedom it gave me. I occasionally drove 18-wheelers, but the shipping company I worked for typically assigned us slightly smaller rigs, which I actually preferred since they handled better on winding roads. My routes varied quite a bit. Sometimes I'd be driving through bustling cities in broad daylight, and other times I'd find myself on desolate highways in the dead of night. The night shifts were a mixed blessing. Fewer vehicles on the road meant quicker deliveries, but the isolation could be unnerving. It was during one of these night shifts in late autumn when everything happened. The weather had turned unexpectedly cold that week, and a thin layer of frost was already forming on the roadside vegetation. I was cruising down a rural stretch of highway in Montana, surrounded by nothing but towering pine trees and the occasional flicker of wildlife eyes caught in my headlights. Around 2 a.m, as I rounded a bend in the highway, my high beams illuminated a silver minivan pulled over on the shoulder about 100 yards ahead. Its hazard lights were blinking weakly, and I could see a small American flag decal on the rear window, along with what looked like one of those baby on board stickers. I debated with myself for maybe 30 seconds before deciding to stop. In the trucking community, there's an unspoken code about helping stranded motorists, especially in remote areas where cell service is spotty at best. Plus, the thought of someone with a baby being stranded in these frigid temperatures didn't sit well with me. I pulled my rig over about 50 feet behind the minivan, activated my own hazards, and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight from the glove compartment. I also slipped my pocket knife into my jacket. Not that I expected trouble, but my father always taught me it's better to have something and not need it than need it and not have it. The silence was almost oppressive as I stepped down from my cab. No traffic noise, no wildlife sounds, just the occasional metallic ping from my cooling engine and the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The air was so cold, it burned my lungs with each breath, creating little clouds of vapor that briefly illuminated my path in the moonlight. As I approached the minivan, I noticed something odd. Despite the hazard lights, there were no interior lights on. Typically, if someone's having car trouble, you'd see them fumbling with their phone light or checking under the hood. But this vehicle was dark inside. I circled around to the driver's side window, my flashlight beam bouncing off the glass. The driver's seat was empty. Moving my light to the back seats, I expected to see a child's car seat, given the sticker. But instead, I spotted a figure in the far back wearing a dark blue hoodie pulled low, head down as if trying to avoid being seen. "Hey there," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Car trouble. I've got some tools if you need help." No response. I moved cautiously toward the passenger side, thinking maybe they hadn't heard me. That's when I noticed something else strange. There was mud deliberately smeared over the license plate, making it unreadable. Before I could process what that might mean, the side door of the minivan slid open with a loud thunk. The hooded figure emerged swiftly, and I caught the glint of something metallic in their right hand. They were average height, but moved with purpose. Wearing what I now could see was a navy hoodie with some kind of sports logo on it. The figure was now stepping towards me, and I could clearly make out what appeared to be a hunting knife with a serrated edge. They weren't pointing it directly at me yet, but the message was clear. This wasn't a stranded motorist. This was a setup. My heart hammering against my ribs, I took 3 rapid steps backward, then pivoted and sprinted toward the tree line about 20 yards away. I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, gaining ground quickly. The forest was dense and pitch black, but fear is one hell of a navigational aid. I crashed through underbrush, branches whipping against my face as I zigzagged between trees. After running for what felt like 5 minutes but was probably only 60 seconds, I tripped over an exposed root and went down hard, the fall knocking the wind from my lungs. I lay there gasping silently, certain the sound of my breathing would give me away. But as the seconds ticked by, I realized the footsteps had stopped. In their place was the sound of someone rummaging through something metallic, and with horror, I realized it was probably the toolbox in the back of my truck. Keeping low, I crept behind a massive pine tree and peered back toward the road. In the distance, I could make out 2 silhouettes now. The first person had been joined by a second, both at my truck. One was trying the door handles, while the other appeared to be using something to try to force the lock. Thank God I'd followed company protocol and locked everything, even for a quick stop. After about 2 minutes of failed attempts, they seemed to give up. I watched as they returned to the minivan, but instead of driving away immediately, they turned off the hazard lights and killed the engine. It dawned on me then, they were setting up for another victim. This remote stretch of highway probably saw just enough traffic for them to try this scheme a few times each night. The family stickers, the apparent breakdown, it was all designed to appeal to people's better nature. I remained hidden for nearly 30 minutes, shivering violently in the cold, before I saw headlights approaching from the direction I'd come from. To my horror, the hazard lights on the minivan blinked back to life, and I watched helplessly as another vehicle, a pickup truck, slowed down. But instead of stopping, the pickup driver flashed their high beams twice and kept going. The minivan's lights went dark again. After another 15 minutes of no activity, I saw the minivan's headlights finally come on. They performed a U-turn and headed back in the direction I'd originally come from. Only then did I dare to move from my hiding spot. My truck was untouched, though there were visible scratch marks around the driver's side lock. I climbed in, hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before getting them in the ignition. I drove nonstop for almost 100 miles before pulling into a brightly lit truck stop with several other rigs parked outside. I reported the incident to both the State Highway Patrol and my company's security team that morning. They told me they'd had 3 similar reports in the past month along that same stretch of highway. 2 weeks later, I heard they'd arrested a pair of siblings who'd been robbing truckers and travelers using exactly this method. Since that night, I've never stopped for a stranded motorist without calling it in first. And I keep my truck doors locked even when I'm inside the cab. Some lessons you only need to learn once. I never planned to be the one telling this story. Most days, I'm just a mechanic in the small town of Millridge, Vermont, fixing engines and minding my own business. But sometimes fate has other ideas. It was the winter of 1987, one of those winters that makes you question why anyone would choose to live in New England. The snow had been falling for 3 straight days, piling up against doorways and transforming the landscape into something alien and forbidding. The call came in just after midnight. My sister Claire's voice was tight with worry on the other end of the line. "Jack, it's Emma. She's running a fever of 104. The roads to the hospital are blocked, and the phone lines to emergency services are down." Emma was my 5-year-old niece, and the thought of her small body burning with fever sent ice through my veins despite the warmth of my cabin. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I promised, already reaching for my coat. The snowmobile was my only option. My truck wouldn't make it through the drifts that had swallowed the county roads. I packed a small bag with supplies, strapped it to the back of the ancient Arctic cat my father had left me, and set out into the storm. The wind was a living thing, clawing at my face, despite the thick scarf wrapped around it. Visibility extended maybe 15 feet ahead, and I navigated mostly by memory and the occasional fence post that hadn't been completely buried. The journey that normally took 12 minutes stretched into 30 as I carefully picked my way across the hidden landscape. When I finally arrived at Claire's farmhouse, I found her pacing the living room, Emma bundled in blankets on the couch. Her little face was flushed, her breathing shallow. "The fever won't break," Claire said, her voice cracking. "I've tried everything." I checked Emma's forehead, burning hot, and made a decision I knew was dangerous but necessary. "We need to get her to St. Mary's." Now Claire's eyes widened. "But the pass, I know a way." I didn't mention that the way was an old logging route across Morrison Ridge that hadn't been maintained in 20 years. It was narrower, steeper, and far more treacherous than the main road, but it would cut nearly 7 miles off our journey. We bundled Emma between us on the snowmobile, Claire holding her tight against her chest while I drove. The engine's roar seemed impossibly loud in the muffled silence of the snowbound night as we set off toward the ridge. For the first hour, we made decent progress. The old route was difficult to follow, but the trees provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. Then came the crossing. Morrison Creek ran fast and deep even in winter, spanned by a rickety wooden bridge that had seen better days decades ago. As we approached, my headlamp illuminated a sight that made my stomach drop. Half the bridge had collapsed under the weight of ice and snow, leaving a gap of about 8 feet between the remaining section and the far bank. I stopped the snowmobile and killed the engine. "What are we going to do?" Claire whispered, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I studied the gap. The creek below was partially frozen, with dark water rushing between sheets of ice. Not deep enough to drown immediately, but in these temperatures, the water would kill almost as quickly as a bullet. "We're going to jump it," I said finally. Claire stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "That's impossible, not if we build a ramp." I pointed to some fallen timber nearby. "And not if we lighten the load." For the next 45 minutes, we worked in silence, dragging logs and packing snow to create a makeshift ramp on our side of the bridge. Emma drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring deliriously about butterflies and summer skies. When the ramp was as good as it was going to get, I turned to Claire. "You need to wait here with the supplies. I'm taking Emma across alone." She started to protest, but I cut her off. "The snowmobile can't make it with all 3 of us. This is the only way." After a moment, she nodded and carefully transferred Emma to me. I secured her against my chest with rope and my coat, creating a makeshift harness. If Claire hesitated, "If something happens, there's a hunter's cabin 2 miles east." "Head there?" I nodded, knowing she was giving me permission to save her daughter, even if it meant leaving Claire behind in the storm. Starting the snowmobile, I backed up 30 yards to get enough runway. The headlamp illuminated our crude ramp, the broken bridge, and the dark gap beyond. I revved the engine, feeling its vibration through my entire body. "Hold on, Butterfly," I whispered to Emma, using her nickname. Then I gunned it. The snowmobile surged forward, gathering speed across the hard-packed snow. The ramp rushed toward us, growing in my vision until it filled everything. We hit it at precisely 32 miles per hour. I know, because I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the speedometer at that exact moment. For 3 eternal seconds, we were airborne. The sensation was unlike anything I'd ever felt, a strange weightlessness, as if the laws of physics had momentarily been suspended. Emma stirred against my chest. Below us, the dark water of Morrison Creek waited. We hit the opposite bank hard, the front of the snowmobile digging into the snow as we skidded forward. For one terrifying moment, I thought we were going to slide backward into the creek. But then the treads caught, and we lurched up onto solid ground. I sat there for several seconds, heart pounding in my ears, before looking back across the gap where Claire stood. Even from this distance, I could see her shoulders sag with relief. "I'll come back for you," I shouted, but the wind carried my words away. She waved, indicating she understood, then pointed urgently toward the road. "Go," her gesture said. "Save Emma." The rest of the journey was a blur of white landscapes and determination. We reached St. Mary's Hospital just before 3 in the morning. where doctors immediately took Emma to treat what turned out to be a severe case of pneumonia. "You saved her life," the doctor told me later. "Another hour, and we might have been having a very different conversation." 2 days later, when the plows finally cleared the main roads, Claire arrived at the hospital, exhausted but safe. She had waited out the worst of the storm in that hunter's cabin before being found by a search party. As for Emma, she made a full recovery, though to this day she swears she remembers flying through the air that night, carried on the back of a great metal beast through a storm of stars. Sometimes at family gatherings, she'll ask me to tell the story, and I'll downplay it, embarrassed by what seems in retrospect like a reckless decision. But Claire always steps in. "Your uncle crossed an impossible gap to save you," she'll say. Sometimes the craziest choice is the only one that matters. And in those moments, I remember the feeling of weightlessness as we soared over Morrison Creek. That brief, impossible instant when love and desperation suspended us between earth and sky, between life and death, between what is possible and what must be done anyway. I've always loved my job at Sunbelt Logistics, especially working as a driver for their southwestern distribution hub. It was by far the best position I'd had after years of working warehouse floors and loading docks. The big advantage was rarely having to pull overnight hauls. Most of my routes wrapped up in about 5 hours, which meant that unlike a lot of long-haul truckers, I got to spend nearly every night at home with my family. I'll never forget the one time I didn't make it home after my shift. It all started on a scorching Tuesday in July of 2018, when I picked up a freshly loaded trailer for my rig. I was scheduled to deliver to 4 retail locations across the Arizona desert. When I arrived at the distribution center around noon, the floor manager told me loading might take a while since they were short-staffed during the summer vacation season. So I offered to lend a hand, and since they were genuinely overwhelmed, they gratefully accepted. I helped another worker load boxes and pallets onto the truck, and we finished in record time. The warehouse supervisor thanked me, and I headed out toward my first stop in Sedona. About 90 minutes into my drive, as the temperature outside climbed to 105 degrees, I realized I'd left my insulated water jug at the back of the trailer. Anyone who spent time in the Arizona desert knows hydration isn't optional. The heat can be absolutely merciless. My throat was already parched, and I knew I had another hour of driving before reaching the first store. I decided to pull over on this little unmarked dirt turnout I knew about from previous routes. It was a spot I'd used before when nature called, and no rest stops were nearby. I parked the 18-wheeler, cut the engine, and jogged to the back to retrieve my water. I jumped inside the trailer and started searching, hoping my jug hadn't been buried under other merchandise. Fortunately, I spotted it. It had fallen and wedged between a couple of furniture boxes, but I could easily reach it. Everything would have been fine if I hadn't taken that extra step forward. I'm still not entirely sure what happened. Maybe it was a slight shifting of weight in the trailer as I moved around inside. Or maybe the hydraulic arm on the door had a malfunction. But suddenly, the heavy metal doors began swinging shut behind me. And worse yet, when they slammed closed, I heard the distinctive metallic click of the security latch engaging. I couldn't open those doors from the inside, no matter how hard I tried. I forced myself to breathe slowly and think through my options for escaping the trailer. The doors wouldn't budge, and in my haste, I'd left my smartphone charging in the cab. I started breathing heavily as the realization sank in. I was trapped until someone found me and helped. I hoped someone from the distribution center would call my supervisor when I didn't show up at my first delivery. But even if they did, I had no idea how they'd locate me. I hadn't told anyone about my unscheduled stop on this remote stretch of road. The first few hours were the worst. I've never felt such suffocating heat. It was like being inside a convection oven that was slowly cooking me alive. My head began to swim, and after finishing the last drops of water from my jug, all I could do was pray someone would find me soon. The temperature inside the metal box must have reached 120 degrees. I tried shouting for help, but there was no one around for miles, just endless desert and the occasional passing vehicle on the distant highway that couldn't hear my cries. I tried using tools from the shipment to pry open the door, but nothing worked against the industrial strength locking mechanism. As the hours passed, I started hallucinating from the heat. I thought I heard voices outside and kept pounding on the walls until my fists were raw. The air grew increasingly stale and hard to breathe. Eventually, I lost consciousness, collapsing against a stack of boxes. The next thing I remember is the trailer doors swinging open. The blinding sunlight seared my eyes, and then everything went dark again. When I regained consciousness, I was in the Flagstaff Medical Center. I had been unconscious in that baking trailer for nearly 15 hours, and was only found the next morning when a family of hikers took a wrong turn onto the dirt road and noticed the abandoned truck. They called the highway patrol, who broke open the trailer and found me. The doctors said it was nothing short of miraculous, that I hadn't suffered permanent brain damage from the extreme heat exposure and severe dehydration. My core temperature had reached 104 degrees, and I had lost over 10 pounds of water weight. The medical team worked for 2 days to stabilize my condition. That experience changed everything for me. The company immediately overhauled their safety protocols, installing emergency release latches inside all trailers, and implementing a stricter check-in policy for drivers. I still drive the same routes, but I never, and I mean never, go anywhere without my phone physically on me and without telling dispatch exactly where I am. Sometimes when I'm on the road and past that dirt turnout, I feel a chill despite the desert heat. 15 hours might not sound like a long time in the grand scheme of things, but when you're slowly baking alive in a metal box, believing these might be your final moments on Earth, it feels like an eternity. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.